How often do you need to reblock your knitting? Every time you wash it? Never again. Let's find out. Here is the short answer. You only need to, or more importantly, you only can block your items once. But that doesn't mean you cannot use some tricks to freshen up your knitting once every while. But let's take a step back here and we'll quickly recap what blocking actually is, because ultimately this will answer your question. Blocking typically has two separate components. So, if the edges of your knitting are curling in and you submerge your project in water, pin it to a blocking mat and let it dry, most of the curling will be gone. Why? Well, the contact with water dissolves the relatively weak hydrogen bonds of the individual hair. And then the yarn suddenly becomes a little bit more malleable. And then as the wool dries, new hydrogen bonds are being formed that lock down the shape. But there is also a second component of blocking. Blocking also changes the structure of knitting. So normally when you block things, you also stretch things out to open up the stitches. You do this because all the individual stitches in a row are interconnected. And the stitches that you maybe knitted a little bit on the tighter side will be able to steal some yarn from the adjacent stitches that are maybe a little bit more looser. And then everything will even out and your stitch definition will be a lot neater. Now here is the big problem. More complicated stitches have a lot more friction because the contact area is so much bigger. If you think of knit two together, where essentially two loops are laying on top of each other, there's just so much friction. And compare that to two knit stitches sitting side by side that barely touch maybe a little bit on the sides, not generating a lot of friction. And if you stretch out a fabric, these complicated stitches will often form knot-like structures. Think of an overhand knot that you suddenly pull tight. And because of the high friction, they will not loosen up anymore if you stretch the fabric in the other direction. And then these knots are more or less permanent. And now we can circle back to the initial question. How often should you really reblock your hand-knitted items? Well, you have to face the reality that blocking is more or less irreversible. And thus it's nothing you can do over and over again without damaging the fibers or the fabric permanently. Blocking your colorwork shawl or your lace shawl for the very first time will typically induce an almost magical transformation. But washing that very same shawl one more time will not suddenly turn back the wheels of time. Once it's stretched out, it stays stretched out. However, there's one last factor that comes into play here: humidity. You have to know that there are also other, much stronger bonds responsible for the structure of animal hair, mainly disulfide bonds. You can break those open with a perm, but not with water. And these stronger bonds are responsible for curly hair. And if you have ever looked at sheep wool under a microscope, you would know that it is actually extremely curly. Now, ambient moisture will gradually dissolve those weak hydrogen bonds, and in this moment of weakness, the stronger bonds prevail and the hairs will snap back into their original configuration. Essentially, the edges of your block project in stockinette stitch will eventually start curling in again, depending on the humidity levels, maybe after a day, maybe after a week, maybe after a month. The stretched out stitches, they will remain, but the fibers themselves, they will always try to revert back to the original shape. Think of it as the difference between a perm and a blowout. And just like you probably don't apply a perm every time you wash your hair, you can definitely use a hair dryer to get things back into shape every time you exit the shower. And the same applies to knitting and any type of animal hair. So, to answer the question on a personal level, whenever I wash my important knitted garments, so sweaters or shawls, but not every sock or so, then I will always lay them out flat on a blocking mat, and then I will use some choice pins or blocking combs. With shawls, you can also use these handy blocking wires. And then I use these to get things back in shape. So I make sure that everything is symmetrical. So think of a seamed sweater where I make sure that all the seams are nice and straight, nothing is twisted, or with a raglan sweater that the decrease lines are symmetrical and the color looks nice. With shawls, that everything is triangular again, or circular, whatever it is. But I decidedly don't stretch it out anymore. Maybe I apply the slightest hint of tension, but that's it, because once it's stretched out, it will stay that way. I mean, if you notice your sweater really lost shape after a year or so, then you can try to reblock things. And this would involve submerging it in water, and while the stitches are suspended, you can try to stretch things out carefully in either direction so the stitches can balance out again. But, maybe you can fix some of the issue, but typically not all, because as you wear things, the fibers will start to felt a little bit, increasing the friction, so this makes everything so much harder. And if you've ever tried to rescue a worn out t-shirt, where the seams are starting to twist, one side is longer or so, then you probably know that there are limits to this kind of technique. Anyway, I really hope this helped. Comment below if you have any questions, and if you have a similar question about a knitting issue I could answer in such a short video, then please comment as well. Happy knitting and enjoy the rest of your day.